A black soldier just returned from deployment, ready to finally go home. But when he steps into the airport, everything changes. A racist cop targets him without cause, humiliates him in front of others, and then, just 7 minutes later, he's fired on the spot. What happened next shocked everyone and set off a chain of events no one saw coming. Stay with me. This is a story you need to hear. Before we start the story, comment below and let us know where in the world you're watching from today. And if you find this story impactful, don't forget to subscribe for more. It was just an ordinary Tuesday morning when Corporal Marcus Turner, a black soldier who had just returned from a 6-month deployment overseas, walked into the airport. After months of hard work and sacrifice, all he wanted was to get home, relax, and see his family. He had been through a lot, facing the dangers of war, working long hours in difficult conditions. But this was supposed to be a peaceful homecoming. He stood in line at the security checkpoint, going through the usual routine of taking off his shoes and emptying his pockets. It was nothing out of the ordinary, or so he thought. But as Turner made his way through the metal detectors and gathered his belongings from the conveyor belt, a voice interrupted the calm. "You there. Step aside." The voice was loud and sharp, coming from a security officer who had been watching him closely. Turner turned to face the officer, trying to keep his composure. He wasn't doing anything wrong, so why the sudden attention? The officer, who was wearing a plain blue uniform, pointed at him and waved for him to move toward the side. Confused but still polite, Turner stepped to the side. "What seems to be the problem?" he asked, hoping for a simple explanation. The officer didn't answer right away. Instead, he gave him a cold, almost dismissive look, as though sizing him up. Then, without warning, the officer barked, "Random check. Step over here." Turner, already tired from his long flight, thought little of it. He had gone through security countless times before, and a random check didn't mean anything. He just wanted to get to his gate. He silently complied, but as he walked over, something in the officer's eyes felt off. It wasn't the typical indifferent glance you get from airport staff during routine checks. No, this one was different. It was almost hostile, like he was being judged for simply existing in the space. Turner did his best to ignore the feeling, but the officer wasn't letting it go. "What are you doing here?" the officer demanded. Turner, still trying to stay calm, replied, "Just returning home after a deployment." The officer's eyes narrowed. "A soldier, huh? Funny, I didn't expect to see you here," he muttered almost under his breath. It wasn't a question, it was a statement. A statement that, for some reason, felt far more like an accusation. Turner shifted uncomfortably, but he kept his voice steady. "I'm just trying to get home, that's all." But the officer wasn't done. "Where are you really from?" he pressed, his voice rising a little. It wasn't just a random check anymore. There was something personal in the way he spoke, something that made Turner's skin crawl, and then the officer went even further. "You people, you always find your way into places like this. Why should I believe you?" The words hit Turner like a punch to the gut. It wasn't just an interrogation. It was a direct attack on his identity. His patience, which had been so strong through the months of deployment, started to wear thin, but he remained silent. What could he say? Every instinct told him to remain calm and get through this. There was nothing he could do to change the officer's mindset. But then, just as the tension seemed to grow unbearable, the officer made his move. He stepped forward, a little too close for comfort, and shoved Turner hard against the wall. The action was swift, unprovoked, and jarring. Turner stumbled slightly but caught himself. His heart raced, his mind spinning. What had just happened? This wasn't just a random check anymore. It had turned into something personal, something ugly. The officer stood there, glaring at him, as if daring him to say something, to make a move. Turner's mind raced. Should he fight back? Should he call for help? But as he glanced around, he realized that no one was coming to his aid. The other officers, who had been watching the scene unfold, stood by in silence. Not a single one of them stepped forward to intervene. It was just Turner and this officer. trapped in a moment of pure hostility. "Move!" the officer snapped, his grip tightening. Turner stood still, processing everything. He was a soldier, trained for combat, for dangerous situations. But this was something entirely different. Something he never expected to face in an airport, especially after fighting for his country. And just when Turner thought it couldn't get worse, the officer pulled away, signaling to another officer standing nearby. "Get him out of here," the first officer ordered. Turner was stunned. What did that even mean? Was he being arrested? Fired from his job? He hadn't done anything wrong. The questions raced through his mind, but before he could speak, another voice cut through the air. "Corporal Turner?" The voice was calm, but its authority was clear. Turner turned to see a senior officer, Officer Linda Park, walking toward him. Her expression was unreadable. She looked from Turner to Officer Harris, who had initiated the confrontation. But instead of stepping in to stop the conflict, Park just nodded. Turner's confusion deepened. Was this really happening? Was this how things were done? And what happened next would completely change everything he thought he knew about justice. As Officer Park approached, Turner hoped for some kind of resolution, a sign that someone in authority would finally step in and stop what was happening. But what came next was something he hadn't expected in the slightest. Instead of taking charge of the situation, Officer Park simply glanced at Turner with a cold expression, as if evaluating him like he was just another suspect. She didn't speak to him directly. Instead, she turned to Officer Harris, the one who had started everything. "What's going on here?" Officer Park asked, but her voice was flat, almost as if she had already made up her mind about what had happened. Harris shot a quick, almost triumphant look at Turner before responding. "This guy is trouble. He was being disrespectful, didn't comply with my orders. I don't trust him. We need to get him out of here." Turner's jaw clenched. He couldn't believe his ears. Trouble? He had been the one pushed up against the wall, and now he was being accused of disrespect. His frustration boiled over, but he held his tongue. His training told him to stay calm and keep his emotions in check. After all, he was dealing with people in positions of power, and any wrong move could escalate things further. Officer Park didn't even look at Turner. She was too busy watching Harris, as if she was trying to figure out what was going on. But then, she simply nodded and stepped aside, as if she had already made her decision. "Fine," she said coldly. And with that, the matter seemed to be settled. Turner was stunned. He felt like he was being completely ignored, his very presence being dismissed by the people who were supposed to enforce fairness. Was this really happening? Had it really come down to this? He wanted to shout, to demand an explanation, but before he could, Harris turned toward him with a look that could freeze anyone in place. "You're not going anywhere," Harris sneered. "We've had enough of you around here." Turner's mind raced. What was happening? Why was no one doing anything to help him? He tried to ask again. "What's the problem?" "I'm just trying to get home. I haven't done anything wrong." But his words fell on deaf ears. Harris was already barking orders, telling Turner to follow him to another part of the airport. Turner didn't move. He stood there staring at Harris, trying to process the reality of what was unfolding. But instead of addressing the situation calmly, Harris grew more agitated. "Don't make this worse for yourself," he warned, stepping toward Turner once again. There was a threat in his tone now, and Turner could feel his heart beating faster, knowing full well that any wrong move could end badly. He didn't want to escalate things any further, but he couldn't understand how it had gotten to this point. "Fine," Turner muttered, swallowing his anger. He could feel the tension building in the air, but he had no idea what would come next. Would he be arrested? Would he be taken somewhere for questioning? The uncertainty hung over him like a cloud, thick and suffocating. As Turner reluctantly followed Harris toward a more secluded area of the airport, the weight of the situation finally hit him. The officer was treating him like a criminal, not a returning soldier. He had done nothing to deserve this. He was being punished for something he couldn't even understand. And the silence from Officer Park, the one person who should have been helping, spoke volumes. In that moment, everything felt like it was closing in on him. He had never felt so alone and powerless. He wished he could reach out to someone, anyone, for help. But all he had was the bitter realization that in this moment, he wasn't seen as a soldier. He was just another black man being treated like a threat. As Turner followed Officer Harris down the hallway, he couldn't shake the feeling that everything was moving too fast, too unpredictably. He tried to remain calm, but inside his mind was racing. Why is this happening? He had done nothing to provoke this officer. His only crime was being a black soldier who happened to cross paths with a man who was clearly looking for trouble. The silence from Officer Park still echoed in his head. Why hadn't she stepped in? Why had she just allowed Harris to continue without saying a word? They reached a small security office tucked away in the corner of the airport. Turner hesitated, but Harris motioned for him to enter. "Sit," Harris ordered gruffly, pointing at a worn-out chair by the desk. Turner, unsure of what to do, complied, but he couldn't stop his mind from spinning. The walls felt like they were closing in on him, and the oppressive silence only made it worse. Harris took a seat behind the desk, glancing at Turner as though he were some kind of nuisance. "You've got some explaining to do," he said, tapping his fingers on the table. The officer's face was hard, emotionless, and Turner couldn't tell if it was just his usual demeanor or if it was something else, something deeper, more malicious. He was still processing the fact that this officer had actually pushed him, something that should never happen in a situation like this. And yet, it felt like it was being brushed aside as if it didn't matter. Turner took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "I don't understand. I've done nothing wrong. Why am I being treated like this?" His voice was firm, but it was hard to keep the frustration out. He had been nothing but polite from the start, trying to keep things respectful. But now, standing here in this tiny room, it was clear to him that none of that mattered. His presence, his uniform, the color of his skin, none of it mattered to Harris. Harris didn't respond right away. Instead, he just stared at Turner for a long, uncomfortable moment, like he was waiting for something, waiting for Turner to slip up or show weakness. Finally, he spoke, his voice dripping with disdain. "You think you can just waltz in here wearing that uniform and act like you're above everyone else? Like we should just roll out the red carpet for you? That's not how it works here." The word stung. Turner couldn't believe what he was hearing. Is this really happening? He thought. Is this really how he sees me? But he stayed quiet, not wanting to make the situation worse. Harris was digging in his heels, and Turner knew better than to escalate things further. But the officer's words kept repeating in his mind. "You think you're above everyone else?" Turner had spent years defending his country, working side by side with people from all walks of life. He had earned every inch of the respect that came with his uniform. But none of that mattered to Harris. In his eyes, Turner wasn't a soldier. He was just a black man to be dismissed, controlled, and humiliated. Harris leaned forward, his gaze growing colder. "You don't belong here," he muttered almost to himself. "I've seen people like you before. You think the world owes you something just because you put on a uniform. But you don't get to walk around acting like you're better than everyone else. Not here. Not today." Turner felt a surge of anger rise within him. It was hard to believe that a person who wore the same badge and uniform as he did could think this way, could treat another human being like this. He wanted to scream, to tell Harris that he was wrong, that what he was doing was not only unfair, but outright disgusting. But Turner bit his tongue, knowing that any outburst would only make things worse. Instead, he sat there in silence, trying to process the harsh reality that this officer was intentionally treating him like dirt, simply because of his race. The weight of it settled on him like a stone in his stomach. This wasn't just a random check gone wrong. This was something deeper, something much more troubling. The silence in the room stretched on, and Turner could feel his chest tightening. Harris had gone quiet, his eyes fixed on Turner as if he was waiting for some kind of reaction. But Turner didn't give him the satisfaction of seeing him break. He just sat there, staring back at Harris with a quiet defiance, holding on to the last bit of control he had in the situation. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Harris broke the silence. He stood up abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. "I don't know what your problem is," he said, shaking his head. "But I'm done here. We don't need your kind around. You're nothing but trouble." Turner's heart sank. Done? What does that even mean? Harris walked toward the door, but before he left, he turned back, his eyes cold and menacing. "Get out of here, soldier. You're not welcome." With that, he walked out, leaving Turner alone in the small, sterile room, feeling completely powerless. Turner sat there for a few moments, his mind reeling. What just happened? How had everything gone so wrong so fast? He had been expecting some kind of explanation or an apology, but instead, he had been told to leave, dismissed as though his very presence was a problem. It didn't make sense. None of it did. But the worst part was yet to come, and Turner had no idea just how much worse it was about to get. Turner sat in the small room for what felt like an eternity, the words Harris had thrown at him echoing in his mind. "We don't need your kind around here." It felt like a slap to the face, but it also felt all too familiar. The weight of those words, the sheer hatred behind them, made his chest tighten. It wasn't just a one-off incident. It was something deeper, something embedded in the way Harris looked at him, as though his very existence was a problem. The door swung open suddenly, breaking his thoughts. Turner looked up to see Officer Park stepping into the room, her face expressionless as usual. She didn't acknowledge him at first, just stood there for a moment, looking around the small office as if trying to gather her thoughts. Turner wondered if she had seen the whole exchange with Harris, if she had heard everything that had been said, but she didn't say a word about it. Instead, she just took a seat across from him. "Corporal Turner," she started, her tone cold and detached. "I'm going to need you to leave. There's been a decision made." Turner's heart skipped a beat. "Leave," he repeated, his voice rising in disbelief. "What do you mean, leave? I didn't do anything wrong. I was just trying to get through security like anyone else." Park sighed, almost as if she were bored with the conversation. "It's not about that," she said, her eyes briefly meeting his before she looked down at the table. "It's about your behavior. We don't tolerate disrespect here, and you've made this situation more complicated than it needs to be." The words hit Turner hard. Disrespect? He had been nothing but cooperative. He had been pushed, yelled at, and accused of things he hadn't done. Yet here she was, treating him as if he was the one in the wrong. The entire thing felt surreal. How had it come to this? Turner tried to keep his voice steady, but he couldn't help the frustration that seeped into it. "I'm a soldier," he said, trying to make her understand. "I've served this country for over a decade. I've earned respect. I've earned my place in this world. And you're telling me that this is how I'm treated, like a criminal?" Park didn't flinch. She remained as cold as ever. "I don't care about your military background," she replied flatly. "What matters now is the situation here. Officer Harris has made it clear that you're not welcome. He's called for backup, and the decision has been made for you to leave the premises. This conversation is over." Turner's stomach churned. It was clear now. This wasn't about his behavior. It wasn't even about the way Harris had treated him. This was about something much bigger. He was being kicked out, not because of any legitimate reason, but because someone didn't like the way he looked, the uniform he wore, or the color of his skin. There was no justice here, just raw, unchecked power. As the weight of it settled in, Turner stood up slowly, his mind racing. There was nothing left to say. He had no recourse, no way to fix this. His anger was building, but he didn't let it show. He wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing him lose control. He took a deep breath, stood tall, and nodded toward Officer Park. "Fine," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I'll leave. But I won't forget this." Park didn't respond. She simply stood up as well, stepping aside to let him exit the room. As Turner walked out of the security office, the weight of what was happening grew heavier. He had been humiliated. He had been treated like an outsider in the very country he had fought to protect. And for what? Because a racist officer decided that a soldier didn't belong in an airport? The hallway outside the office was quiet, the usual hustle and bustle of the airport now muted in the wake of what had just occurred. Turner made his way toward the exit, trying to ignore the stares of the other officers who stood by, their eyes following him as he passed. He didn't know if they were watching him because they were complicit or because they didn't care. Either way, it felt like the whole system was failing him. He had just been kicked out of an airport, dismissed like trash, and there was nothing he could do about it. But as he reached the door and stepped outside, a voice called out behind him, "Turner!" He turned around, startled. It was Officer Harris again, standing in the doorway of the security office. Harris stepped forward, his expression still cold, but there was something different in his eyes now, something darker, more menacing. "Before you go," Harris said, his tone still dripping with contempt, "I want you to understand something. We don't tolerate people like you here. You might have that uniform, but you don't belong in this airport. Not now, not ever." Turner's hands balled into fists, his body tense, but he didn't say a word. There was no point. Harris had already made up his mind, and nothing Turner said was going to change that. Instead, he turned and walked away, leaving the airport behind him. The injustice of it all stung, but Turner knew one thing for sure. This wasn't over. The fight for his dignity, for his right to be treated as a person and not a threat, was far from finished. He didn't know what would happen next, but one thing was certain. He wasn't going to let this moment define him. As Turner walked away from the airport, the anger bubbling inside him didn't subside. The cold words from Officer Harris still stung, each one a reminder of how deep the prejudice ran. He was a soldier. He had served his country, put his life on the line, and here he was, being kicked out of an airport simply because of the color of his skin. It didn't make sense. None of it did. How could someone who wore the same uniform, someone who was supposed to uphold justice, treat him like that? How had a simple routine security check turned into an act of racial discrimination that felt all too familiar? The parking lot was nearly empty when Turner reached his car. He unlocked the door with a click and slid into the driver's seat, gripping the wheel with both hands. His mind was racing. What now? The weight of the situation hadn't fully hit him yet. He wasn't just angry, he was heartbroken. He had trusted that, no matter what, the system would protect him. He had expected fairness. But today, that fairness had been stripped away in a matter of minutes. Turner started the engine, the low rumble of the car filling the otherwise quiet space. He pulled out of the parking lot, his thoughts still swirling. What kind of country have I been fighting for all these years? He wondered. How many others have been treated like this? As the miles passed, his anger started to turn into something else. Determination. This wasn't just about one incident, one racist officer. This was part of something bigger. Turner had seen the news, heard the stories of injustice, of black men and women being mistreated by those who were sworn to protect them. He had always known about racism, but experiencing it firsthand like this was something different. It felt like a slap in the face, and now he couldn't ignore it. He couldn't just walk away from this. The thought of letting it go, of allowing it to slide as if nothing had happened, was impossible. But what could he do? How could he make them understand the pain, the humiliation that he had just endured? Turner thought about the other people in the airport who had watched the whole situation unfold. Why hadn't anyone stepped in? Why hadn't anyone said anything? Was it because they didn't care, or was it because they were afraid? It was hard to tell, but it didn't matter. Turner couldn't rely on anyone else to stand up for him. He would have to fight this battle on his own. By the time he reached his apartment, the anger had settled into a quiet resolve. He was determined to do something about what had happened. He knew that what Harris had done wasn't just a personal failure. It was a reflection of a broken system, one that allowed racism to thrive unchecked, even in places where it was supposed to be eradicated. Turner knew he couldn't let this stand. If he let it go, it would only happen again to someone else. He walked into his apartment and dropped his bag onto the floor. The familiar surroundings of his home didn't offer the comfort they usually did. The weight of everything still pressed on him. He took out his phone and stared at the screen, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. There were so many things he wanted to say, but where to start? Should he file a complaint? Should he go public with the story? Turner's fingers began typing, slowly at first, then faster as the words started to flow. "This is bigger than me," he thought as he wrote. "This is about making sure something like this doesn't happen to anyone else." He wasn't just going to take this lying down. He couldn't. Before he knew it, he had written a lengthy post on social media, detailing what had happened at the airport, how Officer Harris had singled him out, how he had been humiliated and dismissed simply because of his race. He spoke about the lack of support from Officer Park, how the whole situation had left him feeling helpless and unseen. He shared the pain, the frustration, and the anger he had felt in that small office, trapped between a racist cop and a system that refused to acknowledge its own flaws. He hit post and sat back in his chair, staring at the screen. A few seconds later, the notifications started coming in. Comments, shares, likes. People were reading his story. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about making sure his voice was heard, about standing up for others who might be going through the same thing. The weight was still there, heavy in his chest, but for the first time since the incident, he felt like he was doing something. Turner didn't know where this would lead, but he knew one thing for sure. He wouldn't back down. He wasn't going to let this injustice slide. The fight was far from over, and now, more than ever, he was ready to take it on. The hours after Turner posted his story were a blur. At first, it felt like nothing was happening. The silence was deafening, as though the whole world was waiting for someone to acknowledge his pain, to stand with him. But then, slowly, the comments began to roll in. At first, it was just a few, people who'd shared similar experiences, who could relate to the feeling of being wrongly targeted, who offered words of solidarity. "You're not alone," one person wrote. "This is happening all over the country." Then more came. Turner's phone buzzed constantly as more people saw the post, shared it, commented on it. Messages flooded his inbox, some from strangers, some from friends and former colleagues. People thanked him for speaking up, for telling a story that so many others had kept hidden, buried under the weight of silence and fear. He was surprised by the support, overwhelmed by it. But there was something else, something unsettling mixed in with the encouragement, an unmistakable pattern. A few messages were filled with hostility, with accusations that he was making things up or exaggerating the situation. "You should be grateful they let you through it all," one user commented. "You're making this a race thing when it wasn't. Maybe you should just follow the rules next time." Another message read, "You're just looking for attention. Stop stirring up trouble." Turner's heart sank as he read these messages. There was always a part of him that knew people would try to dismiss him, but seeing it written out, seeing the blatant disregard for his pain, was harder than he thought. Still, he didn't let it stop him. He had seen this before, the way people would deny the reality of racial prejudice, the way some would twist the narrative to protect their own biases. But Turner wasn't backing down. He wasn't about to let those messages silence him or erase his truth. As the evening wore on, his story gained traction. News outlets began reaching out for statements, asking for interviews. His post had gone viral, catching the attention of local news stations and social media influencers who were equally outraged by what had happened. It felt surreal. Turner had never expected his experience to become a public rallying cry. But here it was, spreading across the country, becoming a conversation people couldn't ignore. It was no longer just about one airport incident. It was about a larger issue that was deeply embedded in American society, one that affected people of color every single day. That night, as Turner scrolled through the growing sea of responses, something clicked in his mind. The viral response wasn't just about people agreeing with him. It was about the people who saw what had happened and realized they had to do something about it. It was about the collective outrage that had been bubbling just beneath the surface for years, waiting for a moment like this to explode. Turner knew he had ignited something bigger than himself. The phone calls began to pour in. Some were from organizations dedicated to racial justice, offering support. asking him to share his story in front of larger audiences. Others were from legal teams, suggesting that he file a formal complaint, that he take this to court. But Turner wasn't sure about that. The legal system had never been kind to people like him. What good would it do? The more he thought about it, the more he realized that this wasn't just about his own fight. This was about something larger, something systemic. But he knew he had to keep pushing. His voice mattered now. Just when it seemed like everything was moving at lightning speed, Turner's phone buzzed again. This time it was a call from his commanding officer. "Corporal Turner," the voice on the other end said, sounding stiff and official. "This is Lieutenant Daniels from your unit. I've seen what's going on. I just wanted to check in with you and make sure you're all right." Turner was surprised. "Thank you, Lieutenant," he said, his voice quieter now, the exhaustion of the day settling into his bones. "I'm doing okay, but it's been a lot to process. I didn't expect it to get this big." There was a pause on the other end. Then Lieutenant Daniels spoke again, his tone a little softer. "Look, I can't speak for the airport, but I want you to know that I'm behind you. If you need anything at all, don't hesitate to reach out. We're a team, and as far as I'm concerned, you've done nothing wrong." Turner nodded, though the officer couldn't see him. Hearing those words, "You've done nothing wrong," felt like a small weight lifting off his shoulders. It was a reminder that not everyone in authority thought like Harris, that not everyone was willing to turn a blind eye to injustice. It was comforting, even if it didn't make the situation go away. After they hung up, Turner stared at his phone again. He'd spoken to a few supportive people, but this was different. This was coming from his unit, from people he had served with, people who had fought beside him. The reality was sinking in. This was his moment to make a real change, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever faced the same kind of treatment. This wasn't about personal revenge or settling a score. It was about bringing awareness to something that had been ignored for far too long. He wasn't just a soldier anymore. Turner was becoming a symbol, a voice for those who had been silenced by fear or the system. The fight was no longer just about the incident at the airport. It was about raising awareness of systemic racism in law enforcement, about giving a platform to those who had been overlooked for too long. As the night stretched on, Turner knew the battle was far from over. The path ahead would be difficult, but he wasn't afraid anymore. He had a cause now. He had the support of his community, and he had the courage to keep pushing, no matter how hard it got. The world was listening, and Turner was ready to make his voice heard. The next few days passed in a blur of media interviews, phone calls, and overwhelming messages from all corners of the internet. Turner barely had time to process everything. His story had sparked outrage, but it had also sparked conversations that he never imagined he'd be part of. People were talking about racial profiling, the abuse of power, and the systemic racism that was embedded in institutions across the country. It wasn't just an isolated incident at an airport anymore. It was a symptom of something much larger. Despite the outpouring of support, Turner couldn't help but feel drained. Each interview, each message, felt like another reminder of the humiliation he had faced, another blow to his sense of security. He had spent years in the military, fighting for his country, believing that it would protect him in return. But in that airport, in that small room with Officer Harris, he had learned a painful truth. The country he had pledged to serve didn't always see him as an equal. Still, he knew this was bigger than him. He had opened a door and people were starting to listen. But with that attention came pressure. The more his story spread, the more people expected him to do something with it, to take action, to make change. Turner felt the weight of that responsibility. But what could he do? What was the right thing to do in a situation like this? Could he actually change something? Or was he just another voice in a long list of others who had tried and failed? One afternoon, a call came through from a prominent civil rights organization. Turner had heard of them before, the Justice League for Equality. They had been working on cases like his for years, advocating for victims of racial discrimination and police brutality. When the voice on the other end introduced themselves as one of their senior lawyers, Turner's heart skipped a beat. "Corporal Turner, we've been following your story closely. What happened to you at the airport is unacceptable, and we want to help you. You don't have to face this alone." The relief he felt in that moment was overwhelming. He had been struggling with the decision to take legal action. He wasn't sure how far he could go or whether anyone would listen. But now, with the help of a well-established group behind him, things felt different. It wasn't just his word against an officer's anymore. There was a team of experienced people who believed in his cause, who would fight with him. "We're ready to support you in any way we can, whether that's filing a formal complaint, bringing attention to this in the media, or even taking this to court if that's the route you want to go," the lawyer said. "You've already started something huge. We want to help you finish it." Turner sat in stunned silence for a moment, trying to process everything. The idea of fighting a legal battle was daunting. He had never been in the courtroom before, and the thought of facing off against the very system that had failed him was terrifying. But as he thought about it more, the fear started to fade, replaced by a growing sense of purpose. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about everyone who had been treated like he had. Everyone who had faced racial profiling and abuse of power, and had no one to turn to. He finally spoke, his voice steady but filled with determination. "I'm ready. Let's do this." The lawyer's voice brightened. "Good. We'll start immediately. We'll make sure that your story is heard and that you get the justice you deserve." Over the next few weeks, things moved quickly. Turner's case was picked up by more news outlets, and public opinion began to shift. The images of the airport incident, the officer's shove, the way Turner had been treated, were plastered across social media and news stations, further fueling the conversation. People were angry, but they were also motivated. Protests began popping up in cities across the country, with people demanding justice not just for Turner, but for all those who had been victims of racial discrimination in public spaces. Turner wasn't sure what to make of it at first. The support was overwhelming, but so was the attention. Every time he turned on the news or checked his phone, there were more headlines about the case, more interviews asking him how he felt. Some days it felt like he was losing himself in the midst of it all, like his identity was being shaped by something bigger than him. But on the other hand, the momentum was building. People were finally talking about the issues he had been fighting against for so long. The fact that his story had sparked this level of awareness meant that the message was reaching people, real people, who were beginning to understand what so many others had faced. Then, one morning, he got a call that shifted everything. It was from the airport. The voice on the other end was polite but businesslike. "Corporal Turner," the representative said, "we'd like to formally apologize for the incident that occurred on date. We've conducted an internal review and have taken disciplinary action against Officer Harris. We understand that this situation was deeply upsetting, and we want to assure you that we are committed to preventing this from happening again." Turner's mind raced. An apology? Disciplinary action? It felt like a small victory, but something didn't sit right. Harris had been allowed to act the way he did without fear of consequence for so long. Was this apology sincere, or was it just an attempt to quell the growing outrage? He pressed the representative further. "What exactly does disciplinary action mean, and how do I know this won't happen to someone else?" The representative was quick to answer. "We are conducting additional training on racial sensitivity for all security staff, and Officer Harris has been suspended pending further investigation. We're also reviewing our policies to ensure that something like this doesn't happen again." Turner didn't feel relieved, though. It wasn't enough. Officer Harris might have been suspended. But what about the culture that had allowed him to behave this way in the first place? What about the other officers who stood by and did nothing? What about the system that protected men like Harris, that allowed them to use their power to humiliate and control others? Turner knew the apology was just a start. There was still a long road ahead, but it was a step in the right direction. And now, with the support of his legal team, the attention of the public, and the voices of so many people standing behind him, Turner was ready to see this through to the end. The fight for justice was just beginning. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. Turner, along with his legal team, began to prepare for the next phase of the battle. The apology from the airport felt hollow to him. It was just a small concession meant to calm the storm, not a true reckoning with the deeper issues of racism within their ranks. But Turner wasn't in this for a simple apology. He was in it for something much bigger. He wasn't going to stop until the entire system that had allowed officers like Harris to behave without consequence was held accountable. The civil rights organization working with Turner had been instrumental in pushing forward. They helped draft press releases, coordinate protests, and ensure that his story remained at the forefront of the public eye. It wasn't just about the incident at the airport anymore. It was about systemic change. Turner began to realize that what had happened to him wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a larger pattern, a problem that stretched far beyond one officer or one airport. Across the country, people of color were being profiled, harassed, and mistreated, and far too often, the system failed to protect them. Turner started to get calls from people who had faced similar experiences: black soldiers, everyday workers, parents, and students, each sharing their stories of discrimination and abuse by law enforcement. The more he listened, the more determined he became. This wasn't just his fight anymore. It was the fight of thousands, if not millions, of people who had been suffering in silence for far too long. But there was another side to this. Turner was now under constant public scrutiny. His social media had become a battleground, with people either praising him for his bravery or condemning him for stirring up trouble. His phone rang incessantly, sometimes with offers of help, other times with threats and hateful messages. The weight of it all felt suffocating at times. Every word he spoke, every action he took, seemed to be analyzed, critiqued, and dissected. Despite the overwhelming pressure, Turner knew he had to keep pushing forward. He had started this fight, and now there was no turning back. He couldn't afford to let the noise drown him out. There were people who needed him to stand tall, to continue speaking out no matter how difficult it became. One evening, as Turner sat in his apartment, staring at his phone, he saw that the situation had escalated. The airport had released a statement, claiming that Officer Harris had been temporarily suspended as part of their investigation, and that the incident was regrettable but isolated. The airport had promised that they were committed to diversity and inclusion, and that further training would be conducted for their staff. It all sounded too rehearsed, like the words of a corporation trying to placate the public without addressing the real issues. The public backlash against the airport was immediate. People weren't satisfied with the response. The statement felt like a band-aid on a wound that needed surgery. Harris wasn't the only problem. He was just a symptom. The entire system needed to change. Turner knew what he had to do next. The day after the airport statement, Turner found himself in front of a camera again. This time it wasn't just a brief interview. This was a major news broadcast, one that was going to air nationwide. His legal team had arranged the interview to keep the pressure on, to ensure that the airport couldn't brush the incident under the rug. Turner was nervous, but there was a quiet resolve in him as well. This was his chance to speak directly to the public, to share the truth about what had happened, and to demand real action, not empty promises. As the camera crew set up, Turner's mind wandered to the early days of his military service, when he had first put on his uniform and pledged to serve his country. He had been so proud then, proud to defend the ideals that America claimed to uphold. But after everything that had happened, after the treatment he had received, he wasn't so sure anymore. How could he have spent years serving a country that didn't always serve him back? The interview began, and Turner took a deep breath. The anchor asked him about the incident, about how he felt when Harris had singled him out and shoved him. Turner felt the anger begin to build again, but he kept his voice steady. "I felt humiliated. I felt small. It wasn't just the shove or the way he spoke to me. It was the fact that no one stood up for me. No one said anything. Officer Park just watched as Harris treated me like that. And that's what hurts the most, knowing that people in power, people who are supposed to protect us, are the ones doing this." He paused, letting the words sink in before continuing. And it's not just me. This happens to black people every day. It happens in airports, on the streets, in schools, in stores. It happens in places where we're supposed to be safe. And when we speak up, we're told to be quiet, to stop making trouble. But this is the reality we face. And I'm not going to stay silent anymore. I won't stop until something changes. The anchor nodded, clearly moved by his words. But Turner knew that this wasn't enough. The interview would air, and people would watch, but the system would keep turning unless there was real, sustained pressure to make it change. The next few days were filled with more media appearances, more protests, and more interviews. But Turner knew that the work ahead of him wasn't going to be easy. He wasn't just fighting one racist cop anymore. He was fighting an entire system, one that had been built on inequality and injustice. The road ahead would be long and hard, but Turner had no intention of backing down. He had ignited something that couldn't be snuffed out. This wasn't just about his case. This was about a movement that would keep growing and keep demanding change. Turner wasn't going to rest until the airport, and every institution like it was held accountable. This was just the beginning, and as he looked into the camera and spoke the truth, he knew that he was no longer just a soldier. He was a voice for the voiceless, a warrior in a fight much bigger than anything he had ever faced. The pressure didn't let up. If anything, it grew even heavier as Turner's story spread further. The protests at airports, schools, and government buildings grew larger. People were marching, holding signs that read, "Justice for Turner," and "End racial profiling now." His face had become a symbol of resistance, of a man who had been wronged and refused to back down. News outlets across the country kept his story alive, with new segments airing every day. Politicians, activists, and even celebrities began to weigh in. Some expressed support, others were more cautious, but the conversation had reached a tipping point. But amidst all the chaos, Turner began to feel the toll. The constant barrage of phone calls, interviews, and messages took a mental and emotional toll on him. There were days when it felt like he couldn't escape it, like every moment was consumed by the battle for justice. He wasn't just dealing with the trauma of what had happened at the airport anymore. Now he was carrying the weight of an entire movement on his shoulders. In the midst of this whirlwind, Turner found solace in the support of his family and close friends. They reminded him why he had started this fight in the first place, because the injustice he had faced was part of something bigger, and it was a fight worth continuing. They reminded him that he was not alone in this, that the voices of millions of people were standing with him, but even their encouragement couldn't take away the deep, gnawing fatigue that had begun to settle in. Then came a turning point, something that brought new hope to Turner and his supporters. One morning, a message came through. It was from Officer Park, the officer who had been silent during the confrontation, the one who had done nothing to intervene when Harris shoved Turner. Turner had been expecting nothing from her, but this message was different. It was an apology, a real, heartfelt apology. "I've been following the coverage of your case, and I wanted to reach out. I've thought a lot about what happened, and I realize that I failed you. I failed to stand up when I should have, and for that I am truly sorry. I can never undo the hurt I caused, but I want you to know that I see you now, and I will do better moving forward." Turner read the message several times. At first, he didn't know how to respond. He had no idea if the apology was genuine, or if it was just a reaction to the public pressure. But something about it felt different. Maybe it was the fact that Park had taken the time to acknowledge her role in the situation. Maybe it was the fact that someone in the system was willing to admit wrongdoing. Whatever it was, Turner felt a shift inside of him. This was the kind of change he had been fighting for. People recognizing their faults, owning up to their actions, and making a commitment to do better. Still, Turner wasn't naive. One apology wasn't going to fix the system. One officer's change of heart wasn't going to end racism in law enforcement. But it was a start. It was a small, significant step in the right direction. Turner sat down, his phone still in his hand, and thought for a moment. This was the first time in weeks that he felt a glimmer of hope. not just for himself, but for the future. His battle wasn't over, but he knew that what he was doing was making a difference. The conversations had started, the walls were beginning to crack, and real change, though slow, was on the horizon. As he typed his reply to Officer Park, thanking her for her apology but reiterating that the work was far from done, he knew one thing for sure. This fight was worth it. Not just for him, but for every person who had been mistreated, overlooked, or silenced. And he was ready to keep pushing forward, no matter how long it took. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, Turner felt like he wasn't walking it alone. The fight for justice was far from over, but now it felt like it had a chance. As the weeks went by, the momentum behind Turner's case only grew. What had started as a personal fight against a racist officer had now evolved into a full-blown movement, one that was demanding accountability not just from law enforcement, but from institutions everywhere. The hashtag #, Justice for Turner trended every day, with people from all walks of life showing up in support. It wasn't just black communities that were rallying behind him. It was everyone who believed in fairness, equality, and the right to live without fear of being unjustly targeted. Turner's life, which had once been consumed by the quiet discipline of military service, was now filled with the loud demands of activism and public attention. He attended rallies, spoke at universities, and was invited to forums where people discussed racial justice and police reform. His words were raw, honest, and powerful, reflecting the pain and frustration that so many people felt but had never been able to voice. Despite the growing support, Turner still wrestled with feelings of doubt. The pressure to represent so many people weighed on him. Sometimes, late at night, he would lie awake in bed, wondering if he was doing enough, if his voice was strong enough to make real change. The constant barrage of opinions, both supportive and critical, left him feeling exposed, vulnerable. But every time he doubted himself, he would think about the countless people who had shared their own stories with him, stories of being targeted, silenced, and dismissed. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for them too. And then, there were the quiet victories that kept him going. The first sign of real change came when the airport's internal investigation was completed. Officer Harris, who had been suspended pending the review, was officially fired. The airport issued a public statement acknowledging that his actions were unacceptable and outlining new policies for racial sensitivity training. It was a step, but Turner knew it wasn't enough. One officer out of the thousands across the country wasn't going to fix the problem. This was just a small part of a much larger issue. But Turner didn't stop there. He kept pressing, pushing for more. He worked with organizations and lawmakers to introduce bills that would require comprehensive, nationwide police reform. The goal wasn't just to hold bad officers accountable, but to change the culture that allowed them to operate without fear of consequence. He didn't want a few apologies or token gestures. He wanted systemic change, a culture shift that would affect every corner of society, from law enforcement to corporate boardrooms. His work wasn't without its setbacks. There were moments when it seemed like the public's attention would shift, like the news cycle would move on to the next tragedy or scandal. But Turner kept fighting, knowing that every rally, every interview, and every person who shared their story added another brick to the foundation of change. As summer turned to fall, Turner's fight continued, but so did the toll it was taking on him. The endless media cycles, the constant demands for interviews, and the pressure to be a perfect spokesperson for racial justice began to chip away at his emotional well-being. It was as though every day brought new challenges, new attacks, and new expectations. Some days, the weight of it all felt unbearable. The hate mail, the racist comments online, the trolls who tried to discredit him. It all felt like too much to carry. He knew he couldn't let it stop him, but there were moments when he wished he could just go back to the quiet life he had before, where he wasn't under the spotlight, where he wasn't the face of a movement. But every time he thought about giving up, he remembered the people who had reached out to him, the people who had told him that his voice had made a difference in their lives. They had shared their own pain, their own stories of injustice, and Turner knew that he could never turn his back on them. One of the hardest things Turner had to face was the growing divide in the country. While there was overwhelming support for his cause, there were still those who resisted, who refused to believe that racism was a problem in law enforcement, who saw his actions as divisive rather than constructive. Some of the people who had been quiet at first were now openly hostile. It wasn't just about Turner anymore. It was about the larger conversation on race and privilege, and it felt like people were picking sides. But Turner pressed on, refusing to let the negativity silence him. He kept talking, kept speaking out, and kept pushing for change, even when it seemed like progress was slow. He was constantly reminded of the reality that real change didn't happen overnight. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. In a meeting with lawmakers in Washington, Turner was asked about his vision for the future. It was a simple question, but one that made him pause. What did he really want? What was his ultimate goal in all of this? He took a deep breath before responding. I want a world where my children don't have to fear that they'll be treated differently because of the color of their skin. I want a world where people are seen for who they are, not for the stereotypes that others place on them. I want a country that lives up to the values it claims to uphold: freedom, equality, justice, for everyone, no exceptions. As the room went silent, Turner knew that this fight was far from over. But for the first time in months, he felt a sense of clarity. He knew what he was fighting for now, and he knew that no matter how long it took, he couldn't stop. The change he wanted to see would take years, decades, maybe longer. But he was ready to spend his life fighting for it. He wasn't alone in this fight, and together they would make sure that the world his children inherited was better than the one he had grown up in. The road ahead was still uncertain, but Turner now understood that real change didn't come from easy victories or quick fixes. It came from persistence, from voices that refused to be silenced, and from a community that was willing to stand together and demand more. And with that understanding, Turner knew he was ready for whatever came next. The fight was far from over, but he was no longer just a soldier in the military. He was a soldier for justice, and he would keep fighting until the battle was won. As winter approached, the fight for justice continued, but so did the exhaustion. Turner's body was worn down, physically, mentally, and emotionally. He had been in the trenches for months now, constantly speaking out, fighting the fight, and trying to balance the overwhelming expectations placed on him. Every day felt like another uphill battle, and the constant spotlight on him was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it was a platform for change, but on the other, it was a never-ending weight. Yet there were moments when he felt a flicker of hope, a reminder that this fight wasn't in vain. One of those moments came when a large national protest was held in Washington, D.C., and Turner was asked to be one of the keynote speakers. Thousands of people showed up to march for racial justice, and Turner stood before them, looking out at the sea of faces that had come together in solidarity. It wasn't just about his story anymore. It was about the collective fight for equality. As he stepped up to the podium, his heart pounded in his chest. The weight of everything, his personal pain, the pain of everyone who had shared their experiences, the pain of a system that had long failed people of color, hung heavy on his shoulders. But he knew he had to speak. This was why he had kept going, for moments like this, when he could stand and say that enough was enough. Today, Turner began, his voice steady but filled with passion. We are not just fighting for one man's dignity. We are fighting for all of us, for every black man, woman, and child who has ever been treated as less than human, for every person who has been profiled, mistreated, and silenced. We are fighting because we know the system is broken, and we refuse to accept it anymore. The crowd cheered, and Turner felt a surge of strength. In that moment, it wasn't just his voice. It was the collective voice of thousands, maybe millions of people who had been affected by racial injustice. His words were no longer just his own. They were the words of the oppressed, the unheard, the marginalized. The energy from the crowd pushed him forward, and he knew that this wasn't just a protest. It was a movement, and it was growing. "I won't stop fighting," he continued, "and I won't let any of you stop fighting either. This is our time to demand real change. This is our time to take back what has been stolen from us, our dignity, our rights, our humanity. We will not rest until we see a world where justice is truly blind." The crowd erupted in applause, and Turner stepped down from the podium, feeling a mix of exhaustion and empowerment. It had been a long, grueling journey, but this was what he had been fighting for. This was the reason he had put himself out there, risked his reputation, and faced the hostility of those who didn't want to hear the truth. The fight wasn't just about his case anymore. It was about changing a system that had been broken for too long. And for the first time in a long while, he felt like they were on the verge of something big. Turner's influence had continued to grow, and so had the pressure. As the months wore on, the momentum for racial justice intensified. But so did the pushback. The louder the calls for reform became, the more vocal the opposition was. Some politicians and media outlets were quick to dismiss the movement, framing it as a threat to the established order. Turner's name had become a lightning rod, a symbol of both hope and controversy. He was called everything from a hero to a troublemaker, depending on who you asked. But Turner didn't let the criticism stop him. Every attack, every attempt to discredit him, only fueled his resolve. He knew the backlash was inevitable. Change didn't come without resistance. It didn't come without people clinging to the status quo, fighting tooth and nail to maintain their grip on power. But that didn't matter to him anymore. What mattered was the people, the families, the students, the everyday workers who had stood beside him, who had raised their voices in protest, who had shared their stories and said, "We've had enough." He kept going, tirelessly working with lawmakers to push for meaningful reforms. He sat in meetings, drafted policy proposals, and worked with civil rights organizations to ensure that the laws being introduced would create lasting change, not just temporary fixes. Turner's team began to rally support in state capitals across the country, building a network of advocates and pushing for legislation that would hold police departments accountable. His legal team filed lawsuits against institutions that had failed to take action against racist practices, demanding justice for those who had been wronged. Despite all the work being done, there were days when Turner felt weary. He had put so much of himself into this cause, so much of his own pain and heart, that sometimes he wondered how much more he could give. The sleepless nights, the constant pressure to perform, the endless media requests, it was all a lot to bear. There were moments when the weight of the world seemed to fall on him, when it felt like the task ahead was impossible. But then, in a quiet moment, he would remember the faces of the people who had stood with him from the start. His family, his friends, the countless strangers who had shared their own stories and supported his. They were the ones who kept him going. They were the ones who reminded him that he wasn't alone in this fight. One afternoon, Turner stood on the steps of a courthouse, preparing to speak at yet another rally. His legal team had just won a major case, one of the first real victories in the fight for police reform. It wasn't the end of the fight, but it was a significant step forward. The crowd was chanting his name, and for a moment, Turner allowed himself to breathe. He stepped up to the microphone, his heart steady, his voice strong. "Today is not just a victory for me or for the people who have been fighting for justice. It's a victory for everyone who has ever felt the sting of injustice. It's a reminder that when we stand together, we can make a difference. But this is just the beginning. We have a long road ahead, and I'll keep walking it with you, every single step of the way." The crowd cheered again, louder than before. Turner raised his hand, his fist clenched in solidarity. He knew that this was just one battle in a much larger war, but the tide was turning. Change was possible, and with every person who stood by him, with every voice raised in protest, that change was coming faster than anyone could have imagined. And so, with the fight still ahead, Turner kept moving forward. He didn't know exactly where this journey would lead, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't turning back. The road was long, the work was far from over, but the future had already begun to shift, and Turner was determined to see it through, no matter how hard it got. By the time the new year arrived, Turner had become more than just the face of one fight. He had become a symbol of resilience, of a movement that refused to be ignored. The pressure, the criticisms, and the exhaustion were still there, but so was the strength of a nation waking up to the truth of racial injustice. Turner wasn't just fighting for his own dignity anymore. He was fighting for a future that was fairer, that was more just, for every person who had ever been denied equality, respect, or basic human rights. It had been over a year since that fateful day at the airport, the moment that had sparked everything. The road had been long, and the challenges had been endless. There had been legal battles, protests, media storms, and countless moments of doubt. But there had also been victories, big and small, that kept the momentum alive. The policy changes he had advocated for were starting to take shape. New laws were being proposed in several states, mandating police departments to implement more rigorous accountability measures. Training programs on racial sensitivity and de-escalation were being rolled out across the country. Turner knew these weren't complete solutions, but they were steps toward dismantling the systems of oppression that had been in place for generations. One of the biggest wins came when a major federal bill was introduced, with provisions aimed at reworking the criminal justice system. It was a direct result of the grassroots efforts that had been built around Turner's story. People who had mobilized, who had written letters, attended rallies, and flooded politicians with demands for action. Turner had played a key role in pushing for it, using his platform to lobby lawmakers and speak at hearings. But when the bill passed a crucial committee vote, the weight of it finally sank in. It wasn't a perfect piece of legislation. Far from it. But it was the beginning of real, tangible change. On a cold winter afternoon, Turner stood in front of a crowded room in Washington, D.C., as President of the United States announced the bill's passing. The room was filled with reporters, lawmakers, activists, and community leaders who had fought alongside him. Turner had been invited to speak, and as he walked to the microphone, the weight of everything, the years of pain, the years of struggle, the countless hours of work, pressed on him. But there was also a sense of pride. The hard work, the sacrifice, had not been in vain. "I never thought I'd be standing here," Turner began, his voice steady but full of emotion. "A little over a year ago, I was just a soldier trying to get home, trying to make it through a normal day. I never imagined that the events of that day would lead to this moment. But here we are. We are standing together stronger than ever because we refuse to accept the status quo. We refuse to let silence be the answer. We refuse to let injustice go unchecked." He paused, looking around the room at the faces of everyone who had been part of this fight. The people who had spoken up, who had marched, who had written letters, and who had believed that change was possible. This isn't just my victory. This is our victory. This is a victory for everyone who has been denied justice, for everyone who has felt the weight of racism and discrimination. This is a victory for our children, for the future we are building together. And while today is a huge step forward, I know that the work is far from over. But if this year has taught me anything, it's that when we come together, when we stand united, nothing is impossible. The room erupted in applause, and for a moment, Turner allowed himself to feel the weight of what they had all achieved. It wasn't the end of the road. It was just one chapter in a much longer story. But the progress was undeniable. The country was beginning to change, and Turner had been a part of that change. He had been a catalyst for something bigger than any one individual or cause. As he left the stage, Turner glanced out the window at the bustling city, the lights reflecting off the glass of the Capitol building. He thought about everything he had been through, the pain, the frustration, the doubt, but also about the courage, the hope, and the resilience of so many who had fought alongside him. He thought about his family, his friends, and the people who had supported him from day one. And for the first time in a long while, Turner felt a deep, quiet peace. The road ahead would still be long, and the fight wasn't over. There would be more battles to fight, more injustices to confront. But in that moment, Turner knew that they had already won something incredible. They had started a conversation that couldn't be silenced. They had sparked a movement that wouldn't be ignored, and that, Turner realized, was just the beginning. If you found this story powerful, make sure to hit that like button, share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more videos like this. Your support helps us bring more important stories to light.